Know that feeling when you suddenly understand something that was right in front of you all along, but seeing it clearly changes everything about how you move through the world, and suddenly you realize that most people around you are still operating from the old understanding, and you find yourself caught between wanting to share this revelation and knowing that speaking it aloud might fundamentally alter relationships in ways you cannot predict or control. Jean Piaget spent decades studying how consciousness develops, how we move from one level of understanding to another, and what he discovered about the process of awakening to new levels of awareness was both profound and deeply unsettling. His research revealed that there are specific truths about consciousness development that, when shared prematurely or inappropriately, can actually derail the very process they seek to accelerate. Today, I'm going to share with you the 5 most dangerous revelations that Piaget identified during his groundbreaking work. Truths so powerful that revealing them at the wrong time or to the wrong person can create psychological chaos, relationship destruction, and a form of existential isolation that can take years to recover from. The most devastating mistake people make when they begin awakening to higher levels of consciousness is believing that sharing their insights will help others reach the same understanding, when in fact Piaget's research demonstrated that premature exposure to advanced cognitive concepts can create what he termed developmental arrest, a condition where the mind rejects new information so completely that it becomes immune to growth for extended periods. This phenomenon occurs because consciousness development follows specific sequential stages that cannot be skipped or accelerated through external intervention. And when someone attempts to share insights from a higher stage with someone operating from a lower stage, the cognitive dissonance created is so intense that the mind activates powerful defense mechanisms designed to preserve existing mental structures at all costs. Piaget observed this pattern repeatedly in his studies with children, but he also noted that the same principles apply to adult consciousness development, particularly during periods of spiritual or philosophical awakening, when individuals suddenly gain access to ways of thinking that seemed impossible just months or weeks before. The story begins in 1952, when Piaget was conducting research at the International Center for Genetic Epistemology in Geneva, working with a group of adults who had experienced what they described as sudden shifts in consciousness, moments when their understanding of reality, relationships, and their own identity had fundamentally transformed, seemingly overnight. These individuals had sought out Piaget because they were struggling with the isolation and confusion that followed their awakening experiences, reporting that their attempts to share their insights with family members, friends, and colleagues had resulted in conflict, misunderstanding, and a growing sense that they were living in completely different worlds from the people they cared about most. One participant, a 34-year-old engineer named Klaus, described how his awakening to what he called the interconnected nature of all existence had initially filled him with overwhelming joy and compassion. But when he attempted to share this understanding with his wife and children, he found that his words seemed to create fear rather than wonder, resistance rather than curiosity, and a growing stance that threatened the stability of his entire family system. Piaget recognized that Klaus and the other participants were experiencing a phenomenon he had observed in children transitioning between developmental stages, a period of cognitive reorganization that creates temporary instability while new mental structures are being formed and integrated. However, what made these adult cases particularly complex was that the individuals had awakened to insights about consciousness itself, understanding that allowed them to perceive the cognitive limitations of earlier stages, while simultaneously recognizing that most people around them were still operating from those earlier stages. This created what Piaget termed the revelation paradox, a situation where possessing higher understanding actually increased suffering rather than reducing it, because the individual could see clearly how their attempts to help others develop were instead creating resistance and conflict. During his research, Piaget identified 5 specific categories of insights that consistently created problems when shared prematurely. Truths about consciousness development that were so threatening to existing mental structures that revealing them often caused more harm than good. The first of these dangerous revelations involves the discovery that what most people consider to be objective reality is actually a construction created by their current level of cognitive development, and that individuals operating from different developmental stages literally inhabit different experiential worlds, even when they appear to be sharing the same physical environment. When Klaus first understood this principle, he felt a profound sense of liberation, recognizing that many of the conflicts and misunderstandings in his life were not personal failures, but natural consequences of developmental differences. However, when he attempted to explain this insight to his wife during a heated argument about family finances, suggesting that they were operating from different levels of understanding about the nature of money and security, she interpreted his words as condescending and dismissive, and their relationship entered a period of crisis that lasted for months. Piaget observed that this revelation about the constructed nature of reality was particularly dangerous because it threatened one of the most fundamental assumptions that people use to organize their experience: the belief that everyone perceives the world in essentially the same way. When this assumption is challenged directly, the mind experiences what Piaget called ontological shock, a form of existential anxiety so intense that it triggers powerful psychological defenses designed to restore the sense of shared reality that makes communication and relationship possible. The individual hearing this revelation does not simply disagree with the information being shared, they experience it as an attack on their basic sense of sanity and belonging, which explains why attempts to share this insight often result in accusations of arrogance, mental illness, or deliberate manipulation. The second dangerous revelation that Piaget identified involves the understanding that most human suffering is not caused by external circumstances, but by the cognitive structures that individuals use to interpret and respond to those circumstances, and that changing these mental patterns requires a level of self-awareness and voluntary discomfort that most people are not prepared to undertake. This insight often emerges during the early stages of consciousness awakening, when individuals begin to recognize the difference between their thoughts and their identity, and discover that they have far more control over their emotional responses than they previously believed possible. Sarah, a 28-year-old teacher who participated in Piaget's research, described how this understanding had transformed her relationship with anxiety and depression, allowing her to observe these emotional states without being overwhelmed by them and to make choices about how to respond rather than simply reacting automatically. However, when Sarah attempted to share this insight with her sister, who was struggling with chronic depression, the conversation became extremely painful for both of them. Sarah's sister interpreted the suggestion that she had control over her emotional responses as blaming and invalidating, feeling that Sarah was minimizing the reality of her suffering and implying that her depression was a choice rather than a legitimate medical condition. Piaget noted that this type of misunderstanding was virtually inevitable when insights about cognitive control were shared with individuals who had not yet developed the metacognitive awareness necessary to distinguish between taking responsibility for their responses and taking blame for their circumstances. The sister's reaction was not unreasonable or defensive. It was a natural consequence of hearing information that her current level of development could not process without distorting. Look, I know this might be hitting close to home right now, because if you are going through any kind of awakening process, you have probably already experienced the frustration and confusion of trying to share insights that seem so obvious and helpful to you, only to watch the people you care about most react with resistance, fear, or even anger. Have you found yourself feeling increasingly isolated, like you are speaking a different language, even when you are using the same words, wondering if there is something wrong with you for seeing things that others cannot seem to see? I know how lonely that feels, how it can make you question your own sanity sometimes, wondering if these insights that feel so real and transformative to you are actually just elaborate self-deceptions or signs that you are losing touch with reality. You are not crazy, and you are not alone in this experience. If this resonates with you, leave a simple comment. I feel like I'm speaking a different language. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today, to feel less isolated in their own awakening process. You have more healing power than you realize, just by letting others know they are not the only ones navigating this strange territory. The third dangerous revelation that Piaget documented involves the understanding that most people's sense of identity is composed of roles, beliefs, and behavioral patterns that were unconsciously adopted during childhood and adolescence, and that true psychological freedom requires questioning and potentially releasing these inherited structures, even when doing so creates temporary chaos and uncertainty. This insight typically emerges during what Piaget called the de-identification phase of consciousness development, when individuals begin to recognize the difference between who they actually are and who they have been conditioned to believe they should be. Marcus, a 41-year-old businessman who participated in the research, described how this understanding had allowed him to recognize that most of his career choices and relationship patterns had been driven by unconscious attempts to gain approval from his deceased father, and that his entire adult life had been organized around trying to prove his worth to someone who could no longer acknowledge his achievements. This recognition was initially liberating for Marcus, allowing him to begin making choices based on his authentic values and interests rather than inherited programming. However, when he attempted to share this insight with his younger brother, who was following a similar path of seeking external validation through professional success, the conversation became extremely confrontational. Marcus's brother interpreted the suggestion that his identity and goals might be unconsciously driven as an attack on his autonomy and intelligence, and accused Marcus of trying to undermine his confidence and sabotage his success. The brother's reaction was particularly intense because the insight threatened his sense of being in control of his own life, a fundamental assumption that his current level of development required to maintain psychological stability. Piaget observed that this revelation about inherited identity structures was especially dangerous because it challenged what he called the authorship illusion, the belief that individuals are the conscious creators of their own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. This illusion is not simply a mistake or lack of information. It is a necessary psychological foundation that allows people to function effectively at earlier stages of development. When this foundation is threatened prematurely, before the individual has developed the cognitive capacity to hold a more complex understanding of identity and free will, the result is often existential panic and a desperate need to reassert control and autonomy through increased rigidity and defensiveness. The fourth dangerous revelation involves the understanding that most of what people consider to be love is actually a combination of attachment, projection, and unconscious contracts designed to meet unmet childhood needs, and that genuine love requires a level of emotional independence and self-awareness that makes traditional relationship structures obsolete. This insight often emerges during the middle stages of consciousness awakening, when individuals begin to recognize the difference between loving someone and needing them, and discover that their capacity for authentic connection actually increases as their emotional dependency decreases. Lisa, a 36-year-old therapist in Piaget's study, described how this understanding had transformed her marriage, allowing her to love her husband more fully by releasing her unconscious expectations that he should fulfill emotional needs that were actually her own responsibility to meet. However, when Lisa attempted to share this insight with her closest friend, who was struggling with relationship anxiety and jealousy, the conversation ended their friendship. Lisa's friend interpreted the suggestion that her intense emotional reactions might be related to unmet childhood needs as an attack on the legitimacy of her feelings and the importance of her relationship. She felt that Lisa was trying to convince her that her love was not real, that her partner's behavior did not matter, and that she should accept treatment that felt unacceptable to her. Piaget noted that this type of misunderstanding was particularly common when insights about emotional independence were shared with individuals who were still in the attachment-based stage of relationship development, where love and security were experienced as synonymous, and any suggestion of separation was interpreted as abandonment. The friend's reaction was not simply defensive. It was a protective response designed to preserve her access to what she experienced as her primary source of safety and meaning. From her developmental perspective, Lisa's insights about emotional independence looked like a threat to everything that made life worth living, which explained why she responded with such intensity and why the friendship could not survive the conversation. Piaget emphasized that this was not a failure of communication or emotional intelligence, but a natural consequence of developmental differences that created incompatible ways of understanding what love actually means. The fifth and most dangerous revelation that Piaget identified involves the understanding that consciousness itself is evolving, that humanity as a species is in the process of developing new cognitive capacities that will fundamentally transform how we understand identity, relationship, and reality, and that individuals who awaken to these emerging capacities are essentially evolutionary pioneers, navigating uncharted territory without maps or guidebooks. This insight typically emerges during the later stages of consciousness development, when individuals begin to recognize that their awakening experience is not simply personal growth or spiritual development, but participation in a collective transformation that is affecting the entire human species. David, a 45-year-old scientist who participated in Piaget's research, described how this understanding had given him a sense of profound purpose and connection to something larger than himself, but had also created an overwhelming sense of responsibility and isolation. When David attempted to share this evolutionary perspective with his colleagues and family members, the response was consistently negative, ranging from polite dismissal to accusations of grandiosity and mental illness. People interpreted his insights about consciousness evolution as claims of superiority or specialness, assuming that he was positioning himself as more advanced or important than others. Piaget observed that this revelation was particularly dangerous because it threatened the fundamental assumption that human nature is fixed and stable, an assumption that provides psychological security by making the future predictable and manageable. When this assumption is challenged, people experience what he called species anxiety, a form of existential terror related to the possibility that everything they understand about being human might be subject to change. The evolutionary perspective was also dangerous because it implied that current social, political, and economic structures might be inadequate for supporting emerging forms of consciousness, a possibility that threatened people's sense of security and belonging within existing systems. David's colleagues interpreted his insights as criticism of their work and lifestyle choices, even though he had not intended any judgment or comparison. This reaction was not simply misunderstanding, it was a natural response to information that challenged the foundations of meaning and identity that their current level of development required to function effectively. Piaget's research revealed that each of these 5 dangerous revelations created problems not because they were false or harmful in themselves, but because they required cognitive capacities that develop gradually and cannot be accelerated through external intervention. The individuals who had awakened to these insights were not more intelligent or evolved than others. They had simply undergone specific experiences that triggered natural developmental processes that occur at different times for different people. Attempting to share these insights with individuals who had not yet developed the necessary cognitive structures was like trying to teach calculus to someone who had not yet learned basic arithmetic, not because they were incapable of learning calculus, but because their current mathematical foundation could not support that level of complexity. The tragedy that Piaget observed was that the individuals who had awakened to these insights were often the most compassionate and caring people in their communities, individuals who genuinely wanted to help others grow and develop. Their attempts to share their revelations came from love and generosity, not arrogance or superiority. However, their good intentions could not overcome the developmental reality that consciousness evolution follows specific sequences that cannot be rushed or bypassed. The more they attempted to help others awaken, the more they created resistance and conflict, and the more isolated and misunderstood they became. This isolation was particularly painful because it often affected the relationships that mattered most to these individuals. Klaus found that his insights about the constructed nature of reality created increasing distance from his wife and children, even though his understanding had made him more patient and compassionate with their different perspectives. Sarah discovered that her insights about cognitive control made it difficult to maintain friendships with people who were struggling with emotional difficulties, because her presence seemed to remind them of possibilities they were not ready to explore. Marcus realized that his insights about inherited identity structures made family gatherings increasingly uncomfortable because his relatives interpreted his authenticity as judgment of their choices. The research participants consistently reported that they felt caught between 2 impossible choices: suppressing their insights and pretending to see the world as they had before, or sharing their understanding and watching their relationships deteriorate. Neither option felt sustainable or authentic, and many of them experienced periods of deep depression and existential confusion as they struggled to find a way to integrate their new understanding with their need for connection and belonging. Some participants attempted to find communities of like-minded individuals, but discovered that even among people who had experienced similar awakenings, there were often significant differences in understanding and approach that created new forms of conflict and misunderstanding. Piaget noted that this isolation was not simply a side effect of consciousness development, it was an integral part of the process itself. Just as children must develop cognitive independence before they can engage in truly collaborative relationships, adults undergoing consciousness awakening must often experience periods of existential solitude before they can learn to connect authentically with others from their new level of understanding. However, this necessary isolation was often complicated by the cultural assumption that spiritual or psychological growth should automatically improve relationships and increase happiness, which left many participants feeling that they were failing or doing something wrong when their awakening process created temporary chaos and disconnection. The first dangerous revelation that people must learn to contain involves recognizing that reality itself is constructed differently at each level of consciousness development, and that attempting to convince others of this fundamental truth often destroys the very relationships that could eventually support their growth. Piaget's research demonstrated that each stage of cognitive development creates what he called a coherent world structure, a complete and internally consistent way of organizing experience that feels absolutely real and valid to the individual operating from that stage. These world structures are not simply different opinions or perspectives. They are fundamentally different ways of processing information that create incompatible versions of reality. When Klaus discovered that his wife experienced financial security through accumulating material resources, while he experienced it through understanding the interconnected nature of abundance and scarcity, he initially believed that explaining his perspective would help her worry less and feel more peaceful. However, Piaget's research revealed that world structures cannot be changed through argument or explanation because they operate at a level of cognitive organization that is deeper than conscious thought. Klaus's wife did not simply disagree with his perspective about money. She literally could not process the information he was sharing without distorting it to fit her existing mental structures. Her concerns about material security were not irrational fears that could be dissolved through better understanding. They were natural expressions of her current level of consciousness development that served important psychological and practical functions in her life. The attempt to share this first revelation typically creates what Piaget called reality conflict, a situation where two people are having completely different conversations while using the same words, because they are operating from incompatible world structures that organize information in fundamentally different ways. This type of conflict cannot be resolved through compromise or communication skills, because the disagreement is not about specific issues, but about the basic nature of reality itself. When Klaus suggested that his wife's financial anxiety was based on an illusion about the nature of security, she experienced his words as an attack on her sanity and competence. Because from her perspective, material resources were obviously and undeniably the foundation of security and stability. Piaget observed that individuals who had awakened to higher stage world structures often became frustrated and confused when their attempts to share this revelation failed repeatedly, because they could see so clearly how their insights could help others worry less and enjoy life more. However, what they failed to understand was that their ability to see the constructed nature of reality depended on cognitive capacities that develop gradually through specific experiences that cannot be artificially created or accelerated. Their loved ones were not being stubborn or resistant. They were simply operating from world structures that were complete and functional at their current level of development, and attempting to change these structures prematurely could create psychological chaos and existential confusion that served no beneficial purpose. The second dangerous revelation involves understanding that suffering is primarily created by cognitive structures rather than external circumstances, and that sharing this insight often increases suffering rather than reducing it, because it threatens the fundamental assumptions that people use to organize their emotional responses to difficult situations. The second dangerous revelation involves understanding that suffering is primarily created by cognitive structures rather than external circumstances, and that sharing this insight often increases suffering rather than reducing it, because it threatens the fundamental assumptions that people use to organize their emotional responses to difficult situations. When Sarah discovered that her anxiety and depression were not caused by external events, but by unconscious mental patterns that she could learn to observe and modify, This understanding felt like the most valuable gift she had ever received, and her natural impulse was to share this gift with everyone she cared about who was struggling with emotional difficulties. However, Piaget's research revealed that this revelation about cognitive control over emotional responses could only be integrated by individuals who had already developed what he called metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe their own thinking processes without being completely identified with them. Sarah's sister had not yet developed this metacognitive capacity, which meant that when Sarah suggested that depression was primarily maintained by unconscious thought patterns rather than external circumstances, her sister experienced this insight as invalidation and blame rather than empowerment and hope. From her sister's perspective, the depression was obviously and undeniably caused by legitimate external problems, including financial stress, relationship difficulties, and health concerns. And Sarah's suggestion that these circumstances were not the real source of her suffering felt like an attack on her perception of reality and a minimization of her genuine struggles. Piaget noted that this type of misunderstanding was inevitable because the sister was still in what he called the externalization stage of emotional development, where feelings are experienced as direct responses to circumstances rather than products of interpretation and meaning-making. The third dangerous revelation that must be carefully contained involves recognizing that most of what people consider to be their authentic identity is actually a collection of inherited roles and behavioral patterns that were unconsciously adopted during childhood, and that sharing this insight often triggers existential panic rather than liberation because it threatens the fundamental sense of authorship and control that people need to function effectively at earlier stages of development. Marcus discovered that his entire adult life had been organized around unconscious attempts to prove his worth to internalized parental figures, and this recognition allowed him to begin making choices based on his genuine values and interests, rather than inherited programming. However, when he attempted to share this insight with his brother, the conversation became extremely confrontational because his brother interpreted the suggestion that his identity might be unconsciously driven as an attack on his autonomy and intelligence. Piaget observed that this revelation about inherited identity structures was particularly dangerous because it challenged what he called the authorship illusion. The belief that individuals are the conscious creators of their own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. This illusion is not simply a mistake or lack of awareness. It is a necessary psychological foundation that allows people to function effectively and make decisions confidently at earlier stages of development. When this foundation is threatened before the individual has developed the cognitive capacity to hold a more complex understanding of identity and free will, the result is often existential terror and a desperate need to reassert control and autonomy through increased rigidity and defensiveness. The fourth dangerous revelation involves understanding that most human relationships are based on unconscious contracts designed to meet unmet childhood needs rather than genuine love and connection, and that sharing this insight often destroys relationships rather than improving them, because it threatens the emotional security systems that people have spent their entire lives constructing. Lisa discovered that her capacity for authentic love actually increased as her emotional dependency decreased, and that releasing her unconscious expectations of her husband allowed her to appreciate him more fully as he actually was, rather than as she needed him to be. However, when she attempted to share this insight with her friend, who was struggling with relationship anxiety, the conversation ended their friendship because her friend experienced the suggestion that love and attachment were different things as an attack on everything she valued most deeply. Piaget noted that this revelation about emotional independence was particularly threatening to individuals who were still in the attachment-based stage of relationship development, where love and security were experienced as synonymous, and any suggestion of separation felt like abandonment and rejection. Lisa's friend did not simply disagree with the insight about emotional independence. She experienced it as a threat to her primary source of meaning and safety, which explained why her response was so intense and why the friendship could not survive the conversation. From her developmental perspective, Lisa's insights looked like a prescription for loneliness and isolation rather than deeper connection and authentic love. The fifth and most dangerous revelation involves recognizing that consciousness itself is evolving, that humanity is developing new cognitive capacities that will transform how we understand identity, relationship, and reality, and that individuals who awaken to these emerging capacities are participating in a collective transformation that has no historical precedent or cultural support system. David discovered that his awakening experience was not simply personal growth, but participation in an evolutionary process affecting the entire human species. And this understanding gave him profound purpose and connection to something larger than himself. However, when he attempted to share this evolutionary perspective with colleagues and family members, they interpreted his insights as claims of superiority and grandiosity, even though his understanding had actually made him more humble and compassionate. This evolutionary revelation was particularly dangerous because it threatened the fundamental assumption that human nature is fixed and stable, an assumption that provides psychological security by making the future predictable and manageable. When this assumption is challenged, people experience what Piaget called species anxiety, a form of existential terror related to the possibility that everything they understand about being human might be subject to fundamental change. David's colleagues and family members did not consciously choose to reject his insights. They experienced them as threats to the foundations of meaning and identity that their current level of development required to function effectively in their daily lives. Piaget's most profound discovery was that these 5 revelations were not problems to be solved, but developmental realities to be navigated with wisdom and patience. The individuals who had awakened to these insights were not failures in communication or relationship. They were pioneers exploring new territories of human consciousness without maps or guidebooks to help them integrate their discoveries with their need for connection and belonging. The isolation and misunderstanding they experienced were not signs that something was wrong with their awakening process, but natural consequences of developing cognitive capacities that were not yet widely available or culturally supported. The solution that emerged from Piaget's research was not learning how to share these revelations more effectively, but learning how to contain them with love and wisdom until the appropriate time and context naturally arose for their expression. This containment was not suppression or denial, but a form of developmental intelligence that recognized the difference between insights that were ready to be shared and insights that needed to mature and integrate before they could be communicated without causing harm. Klaus learned to appreciate his wife's world structure without trying to change it, recognizing that her concerns about material security served important functions in her life, and that his role was to love her as she was rather than as he thought she should become. Sarah discovered that the most helpful thing she could do for her sister was not to share insights about cognitive control, but to provide consistent emotional support and presence that allowed her sister to feel safe enough to begin exploring her own internal landscape when she was naturally ready. Marcus realized that his authenticity was not dependent on his family's understanding or approval, and that he could maintain genuine relationships with them by focusing on shared experiences and values, rather than trying to explain his insights about identity and conditioning. Lisa learned to love her friends from their current level of development rather than from the level she wanted them to reach, and discovered that this unconditional acceptance actually created more space for natural growth and exploration than her previous attempts at education and intervention. David found that his understanding of consciousness evolution was most helpfully expressed through his work and creative projects rather than through direct explanation, allowing others to encounter new possibilities through experience rather than through intellectual concepts that their current development could not yet integrate. Each of these individuals discovered that their awakening had not made them teachers or guides for others, but had given them the capacity to love more unconditionally and to serve the evolutionary process through their presence and example, rather than through their words and explanations. The most beautiful discovery that emerged from Piaget's research was that when these dangerous revelations were contained with wisdom and expressed through authentic living rather than direct teaching, they created subtle but powerful influences that supported others' natural development without triggering resistance or defense. Klaus's patient presence with his wife's financial concerns created safety that eventually allowed her to begin questioning some of her own assumptions about security and abundance. Sarah's consistent emotional availability gave her sister permission to explore her own internal landscape without pressure or expectation. Marcus's authentic choices inspired family members to begin examining their own motivations and patterns without feeling judged or criticized. This patient approach required a fundamental shift in how these awakening individuals understood their role in others' development, moving from the helper position to what Piaget called the witness position, where their primary contribution was maintaining their own center and authenticity rather than trying to facilitate others' growth. This shift was initially difficult for many participants because their awakening had increased their compassion and their ability to see how others were suffering unnecessarily, which created a natural desire to help and heal. However, learning to witness rather than intervene ultimately proved to be far more effective in supporting others' natural development while preserving the relationships that mattered most. Piaget's final insight was that consciousness development is fundamentally a collective process rather than an individual achievement, and that those who awaken to higher stages of understanding serve the whole, not by teaching or convincing others, but by embodying the possibilities that naturally emerge at their level of development. The 5 dangerous revelations become dangerous only when they are shared prematurely or inappropriately, but when they are lived authentically and expressed through presence rather than words, they contribute to the collective field of consciousness in ways that support everyone's natural evolution without forcing or rushing the process. You know, sharing this research with you today feels like such a privilege, because if you have made it this far in our conversation, you are clearly someone who is serious about understanding the deeper dynamics of consciousness development and relationship. The fact that you are willing to sit with these complex ideas, to consider that your own awakening process might require patience and wisdom rather than just enthusiasm and good intentions, tells me that you are exactly the kind of person who can navigate these developmental challenges with grace and intelligence. If you have found value in exploring Piaget's insights together, I would love to have you join our community of thoughtful individuals who are committed to conscious development and authentic relationship. Just click that subscribe button below, not because I need the numbers, but because this kind of deep exploration is so much richer when we can continue the conversation together over time. There are so many more discoveries waiting for us in Piaget's work, insights about how consciousness develops through relationship, how we can support others' growth without manipulating or controlling, and how to navigate the inevitable challenges that arise when we outgrow the mental structures that once defined our entire world. The next piece of this puzzle that I am excited to explore with you involves Piaget's revolutionary discovery about what he called developmental synchronicity, the mysterious way that consciousness evolution creates natural opportunities for growth when we learn to recognize and respond to them appropriately. This research will completely transform how you understand the timing of relationships, career changes, and life transitions, and why forcing growth rarely works, while patience and presence create miraculous results. Thank you for being the kind of person who seeks understanding rather than just comfort, and for having the courage to examine these profound questions about what it means to be human in a world where consciousness itself is evolving.